Hello, starfarers, and welcome back to the Tetra Galaxy Telecast. For today's transmissions topic, I'll be taking a look at what exactly Retro Studios could be cooking up with the highly anticipated Metroid Prime 4. I'm going to be giving the all-in-one analysis on everything you'd want to know about the game. I'm talking about story, including characters, plot, and its potential place in the Metroid timeline. I'll be talking about potential new gameplay mechanics and modes that will serve to enhance the experience of the Prime series. I'll be talking about the potential sales numbers the game could reach, and what the potential success of the game could mean for the franchise. And, of course, what would a Metroid Prime 4 video be if I didn't take a stab in the dark trying to guess when we'll, actually get to play the game? But without further delay, let's begin. As far as the story goes, the first thing I'd like to cover is its place in the timeline, because in my mind there are two distinct possibilities for when the game could take place, and those places would dramatically change the story. The obvious one is that the game takes place between Metroid 1 and 2. That would make sense if it was, as the other Prime games all take place between the first two mainline games as well. It would also make sense that if the last Metroid was the baby in Super Metroid, as the game's legendary prologue says, then the one Sylux stole would have to be dead by the time of that game, should that statement be taken at face value. However, considering Prime 4 didn't exist when Super was made, we may not have to take such a statement for fact. After all, Metroids did return in both Other M and Fusion, which take place after Super. That leads us to the other scenario, and the one I personally think is more interesting, which is that the game will be the new endpoint for the timeline, taking place after Dread. I think this is possible for one key reason, which is that the game's development was restarted back in early 2019, being given back to Retro Studios after Bandai Namco was deemed unworthy of wielding the project. By that point, Metroid Dread was already well into development, considering it was teased in 2017 as a bonus image in Samus Returns, and was released in 2021. Since the story of the game was most surely completed by the time Prime 4 was reset, it's certainly within the realm of possibility that Prime 4's story could be developed after the events of Dread, with the story beats of that game in mind. Since these are two very distinct places in the timeline, the other elements of the story, like plot and characters, each would naturally have two distinct outcomes as well. Also, fair warning, my character lineups and stories won't be introducing any new characters, an outcome that is unlikely to happen in the actual game. So take these rosters and stories with a grain of salt. The first of these diverging possibilities I'd like to discuss is characters, including which ones I think will be in the game, which ones I think won't be, and who I want or don't want to see. Because really, other than Samus, Sylux, and most likely the Metroid he stole at the end of Federation Force, we don't know about any characters who will be in the game. The potential character lineup could vary pretty wildly depending on where the game is placed in the timeline. If the game takes place after Federation Force but before Metroid 2, we might see the return of some noteworthy figures in the Federation at the time, like Admiral Dane or General Alex Miles. The Federation Force could also appear in some small way. Perhaps they go missing during a mission, and that's why Samus is called by the Federation. Or maybe you find out that the squad was killed off by Sylux to set up the villain as a real threat. The Space Pirates may also make a return, including Ridley, at it again with yet another desperate bid to capture the Metroids, this time seeking the one that Sylux stole. However, they wouldn't appear in large numbers, considering they just lost a massive amount of their forces to Dark Samus's escapades, and lost more still after the Doomseye and its fleet were destroyed. If they are to appear, it will be few in numbers, operating covertly. I'd also like to think that this would be our best chance at finally getting Meta Kraid, which was a scrapped idea for Prime 1 due to time constraints, which would not only explain his revival in Super Metroid, but seeing him finally make his 3D debut would just be really cool. It would also be cool to see the other scrapped boss from Prime 1 make it onto the game, by which of course I refer to the Sheegoth Prime. Perhaps Sylux could steal it from Talon 4 after it recovered from the Leviathan impact, seeing it as a valuable bioweapon much like the Metroids. Or perhaps it could just exist on whatever planet we'll be traveling on already. Speaking of, since Sylux is all but guaranteed a spot in Prime 4, I wouldn't be too surprised if some of the other hunters returned either. Most likely Weevil, since it's likely the space pirates will be coming back, and being one himself, he might return with them. Candon wouldn't be a far-fetched idea either. I can imagine him wanting revenge on Samus for his defeat by her hand in Prime Hunters. Trace could return as well. He'll surely want to grab the Metroids after failing to nab the ultimate power in Prime Hunters to prove himself to his people, which would be easier now than ever before with the space pirates being dramatically weakened in each of the 2 previous games. Actually, the Kraken Empire as a whole might want to step in and grab that Metroid specimen, as it'd make overtaking planets for their empire incredibly easy to do. Other than that, you'll have your basic bugs and bats and whatnot as enemy types, but that should be all for the key characters. For those whose return I doubt, I can't see Dark Samus coming back, as Phazon was wiped out and Retro probably doesn't want to do the same thing for the 4th time in a row. I also couldn't imagine the Luminoth making a return, as it'd be too early for them to be venturing about considering the state of their planet. There simply isn't enough of a time gap there. It would be too early for Chozo like Ravenbeak to show up, and the same can be said for Mother Brain to be a real factor. After that, you're really reaching for possible characters. Like, somehow I doubt Houston Armstrong is going to be a focal point of Prime 4. If the game takes place after Dread, there's a lot of potential for the character lineups. First off, with Silex in the mix, the door is still open for the other hunters, despite the time jump present here. The space pirates may be gone, but considering that Kraid was in Dread, it's not out of the realm of possibility that another high-ranking space pirate, or at least another member of their species, like Crocomire or Dragon, could come back. Phantoon could also come back, since he's already been in 2 games and could return a 3rd time. The Galactic Federation, and by which I mean the corrupt ringleader faction, could also make their not-so-triumphant return here, gearing up for their latest plot to create and harness bioweapons for themselves after their failed attempts to do so in Other M and Fusion. It's also possible that Living Chozo may appear in this game, as Ravenbeak and Quiet Robe set the precedent for their appearance by this point in the timeline, though of course, it would have to be some new faction since the Thoha and the Makin tribes both died out, not counting Samus of course. The X may also come back themselves, which isn't too far-fetched for 2 reasons. 1, the devs of Mercury Steam brought them back after the ones in Fusion were eradicated, so Retro just introducing another wave of them isn't a crazy idea. And 2, if you notice here at the end of Metroid Dread, these ships in the background disappear during the escape sequence, meaning someone certainly escaped the destruction of ZDR alongside Samus, and since the X had overrun the planet by that point, they'd be the most likely candidate. Seeing as how Other M, Fusion, and Dread are the last 3 games of the timeline, it's likely that Adam would return for the 4th game in a row, chronologically. Now for characters that won't be in Prime 4 in this scenario. Despite how much time has passed since the events of Echoes, the Luminoth probably won't be a part of the story, so as not to take any spotlight from potential new characters, though I could see them being in future games like Prime 5, helping Samus in her quest to stop Silex, or whichever big bad comes after him, as payback for her saving their species. The Space Pirates will also be absent, as Ridley, Kraid, and Mother Brain are absolutely dead along with your average Space Pirate soldier. Phazon is long gone by now, meaning we won't see Dark Samus or the Ying, though the latter died in Echoes anyway, so they'd be absent regardless. Lastly, other than Samus and the larva Silex stole, the Metroids as a species should also be extinct by now. With the possible cast down, the next discussion will be about the plotline of the game. Again, there are 2 very different possibilities for what the story could be here, and again, I'll remind you that this is all speculative, especially since I don't know about any new characters that Retro could have made for this game specifically. The point of these stories is less so to guess what they'll be with 100% accuracy, and more so to create a fun and engaging storyline using exclusively pre-existing characters while also making a cohesive plot whose basic outline could feasibly occur in the real game. Basically, don't come roasting me after the game finally comes out and my story predictions ends up sounding like bad fanfiction in comparison. With that out of the way, here's the first possible scenario. After the disappearance of Phazon and the decline of the Space Pirates, Silex, power-hungry as ever and ready to make his mark on the universe, plans to begin his own horrific line of experiments on the Metroid larva he stole from the Federation. To set his plan in motion, he begins by forming a dangerous alliance with Trace and the Kraken Empire to gain the army he needs to take down the Galactic Federation. You see, the defining character trait of Sylix is his unrelenting hatred for the Federation, and he'd stop at nothing to see them destroyed. It's even said that he fights Samus primarily because she works with the Federation. The Kraken, meanwhile, have a defining characteristic of conquest, as they constantly send out their young to conquer new worlds as a rite of passage, so they are constantly seeking out new worlds to take over and increase the reach of their empire. In return for their help, Sylix promises the Empire all of the planets they would gain from the Federation's absence, except for one as yet unknown planet, perhaps a former homeworld of the Enkren or the Ela, or another race of that like, one which he'd by this point be using as a base of operations. The reason he'll need this planet is so that he can experiment on the Metroid he stole a safe ways away from Federation territory, but also so that he can stay safely away from Samus. Judging by Metroid Prime hunters, Sylix, along with 5 other top-of-the-line bounty hunters, were all defeated in one fell swoop by Guria at the end of that game, and Samus proceeded to beat that same Guria along with his true form in a one-on-one duel. In other words, Samus currently badly outmatches Sylix, and he knows that. He's got a plan to become strong enough to fight Samus, but he's gonna need to buy some time to make it work. To do this, he goes to an uncharted, vicious planet teeming with aggressive wildlife, burrowing deep underground to conduct his twisted experiments. He doesn't stop there though, as he attains even more deadly creatures along with other help to keep him safe from the business end of Samus's arm cannon. First, he takes a quick detour to Zebes to see if he can find anything there. Having heard the legend of Samus' Zero mission, he believes he could find valuable assets to add to his army, and that he does. Finding the former space pirate General Kraid, he brings him back to Zebes, and with the help of the Kraken, he uses machinery to restore the behemoth, resurrecting him as the mighty Meta Kraid. If you're wondering how he's able to infiltrate Zebes and steal Kraid without the space pirates capturing or destroying him, keep in mind that those same space pirates have been dramatically weakened 3 times over by now, so Sylix, an A-list bounty hunter, along with Kraken forces assisting him, should be able to smuggle the Tubby Titan back to his headquarters. He's not done there though, as he then journeys to Talon 4 to see if he can find any information about the Metroids that the space pirates may have left behind to aid his own experiments. While he doesn't find anything of that sort, he does find one fascinating creature, the alpha and supreme predator of the Phendrana Drifts, the Sheegoth Prime. He picks up a few other native creatures as well as the Sheegoth Prime and Kraid, but none of the others are of particular noteworthiness, and with that, he heads back to his base to finally begin operating on the Metroid. He decides against visiting Aether, as the Luminoth are recovering from the Leviathan impact there, and the last thing he wants to do is provoke an elder race into getting involved with the conflict. He also avoids the planets in Prime 3, as the pirate homeworld is filled with deadly acid rain, and the other planets in the game were too close to Norian, a well-secured Federation outpost. He proceeds to bolster his defenses by commissioning Trace and a few other elite Kraken warriors to defend him personally on the planet he's occupying. The last thing he does to strengthen his defenses on his base planet is hiring a couple more fellow bounty hunters, namely Candon and Weevil, to defend him, coaxing them into joining his forces with the promise of getting revenge on the accursed hunter who defeated them back in the Tetric Galaxy. Having garnered such numerous forces, Sylix is confident that the combined power of Meta Kraid, the Sheegoth Prime, several hunters, and the Kraken Empire, along with the potential of his Metroid experiments, will be enough to overpower Samus and the Federation. The Federation, who believed that they had secured peace in the galaxy after the destruction of Phazon and the defeat of the space pirate superweapon, the Doomseye, are shocked to see a sudden increase in attacks from the Kraken Empire. Stunned, they send Samus to see if she can find the cause of the increased hostility from the Kraken. After tearing through a space vessel, she interrogates the Kraken general on board, where she's told about the cause of the attacks, Sylix. She also gets his location out of the general before he and the rest of his soldiers on board are taken into custody by the Federation. The Federation, having heard this, and knowing that Silex stole a Metroid from them, sends the Federation force to the planet to stop his evil schemes. During this time, Samus is ordered by Admiral Dane to continue operating as she had before, taking out the Kraken forces attempting to overrun Federation defenses. Samus, despite wanting to hunt down Silex above all else at the moment, reluctantly agrees, as she respects the Federation force after they manage to free her of space pirate control, and figures that they may be able to stop Silex on their own. Sadly, soon enough, she receives a message from Alex Miles that he has lost contact with the Federation force, and him, along with Admiral Dane who overhears this message, asks Samus to find and rescue the missing soldiers. She agrees, and knowing the danger they could be in, she hightails it out of the area and tracks them down to their last known location, Silex's headquarters. When she arrives on the planet, she begins searching for any useful upgrades she can find on the surface while battling through the ferocious flora and fauna. Keep in mind that most of her upgrades were Phazon based in Prime 3, so she really only has a select few upgrades to start with, and it will take time for her to reach the mark of a heavily upgraded suit. After finding such upgrades, she delves deeper into the planet intending to find Silex, and during her search, she finds the many enemies that have been put out on her path. However, be it the Kraken forces, the other bounty hunters, the mighty Sheogoth Prime, or even the massive Meta Kraid, none of them are enough to stop her as she works her way through the planet and into Silex's laboratories. In these labs, she finds and battles several larval Metroids, results of the experiments he's made, no doubt. As she approaches a gigantic room, no doubt the one Silex is hiding in, she hears someone screaming, and naturally rushes into the room in response. For all her troubles, she arrives just in time to see the last surviving member of the Federation force being annihilated by Silex. Two important developments are then revealed. One is that the Federation force has been used as, essentially, training dummies for Silex to scrap since they were captured. This leads to the other big development, and the reason Silex has gotten so much stronger since his last appearance. His ultimate experiment and plan to become strong enough to fight Samus has worked. He has now successfully fused himself with the Metroid larva he stole from the Federation. This wouldn't be the same as Samus's fusion with the Metroids, as she was infused with their DNA later down the timeline. Instead, Silex would look much more like the Humatroid from the scrapped project known as Metroid Prime 1.5, only now he's much larger and faster than he was before, and of course, as intended, he is now far, far stronger than he'd been prior. A now enraged Samus leaps into battle with the Metroid-infused Silex, engaging in a lengthy, multi-phase fight where Samus triumphs, defeating Silex and avenging the Federation force. Silex, feeling scorned by yet another defeat at the hands of the Hunter, attempts to flee the scene. Unfortunately for Silex, it's at this time that Ridley appears, looking like a mix between his Meta Ridley form and his Proteus Ridley form, crashing down into the room from above and stomping Silex with one fell swoop. It's shown at this time that Weevil, despite agreeing to work with Silex, still holds allegiance to the space pirates, and after he found out that Kraid was kidnapped as a security measure and that Metroids were on the planet, he contacted Space Pirate High Command to send forces to retrieve the valuable assets along with the lost general. After the reveal, the game cuts back to Ridley as he continues to rain fire before he impales Silex, finally putting an end to him and his intrepid schemes. Silex planned even for this though, as he rigged the planet to explode should he be killed to take everyone down with him. Weevil soon enters the room, and Samus is tasked to deal with him and Ridley in a 2-on-1 duel. She of course does win, and while Ridley manages to cheat death yet again, Weevil is heavily outmatched by Samus and is killed in combat. Samus then escapes the planet, and the main game ends. This, for the purposes of the story, will be the first time a Metroid game has two post-credit scenes. The first will be a minor cutscene for continuity purposes, showing that Ridley saved Metacrate during his escape. The second one, which is the really important scene, will be a bloody one at that, where we see Federation soldiers being massacred by superior Kraken numbers, who somehow knew exactly where and when to strike for maximum efficiency. How did they plan out this attack so perfectly? Simple. it's revealed that Alex Miles himself has betrayed the Federation, and he, along with some of the ringleaders, join with the Kraken, setting the stage for the central conflict of Metroid Prime 5. If you're wondering why the ringleaders only joined the Kraken just now, that answer is also simple. Sylux wouldn't let them work with the Federation given his utter hatred for them, and between the ringleaders and Sylux, who had a cohesive, well-executed plan along with Metroids, they chose to work with Sylux. With no such barrier existing after Sylux's death, the ringleaders move in. Also, while not relevant to the story of Prime 4 or 5, it should be noted that some of the ringleaders would remain hidden as a backup plan should their alliance fail, which is my cheap explanation for why they survived to Other M and Fusion, and to our knowledge, they still exist by Dread as well. But that will be all for our first story scenario. It's time to bring our attention to the other possible story of Prime 4. Much of the start of the game will be the same as Scenario 1. Sylux taking over a formidable planet, working with the Kraken Empire, nabbing the Sheoth Prime from Talon 4, hiring Kandin under the guise of vengeance, and experimenting with Metroids will all be unchanged here. The first differences shine through at this time though. Since the space pirates are gone, Kraid cannot be revived, and while Weevil will still be a part of the plan as he isn't confirmed dead by this point, he won't be the same Weevil that we know him as. Since the space pirates rely on strong leadership to maintain sapience, and such strong leadership has been destroyed, he'll be more of a mindless drone driven by his suit's AI functions than anything, making him perfect for Sylux's plans. The prologue can also remain mostly the same, with the ship interrogation and other elements of the like. However, the Federation force wouldn't be sent down this time, as not only would the Federation know by this point that their men can't properly deal with Metroids, but Adam, present in this version of the story, is able to talk them out of the idea of sending the force down. So off Samus goes to this unknown world. Upon landing, much like the last story, she takes on various wildlife, the Sheoth Prime, and Kraken leaders, albeit communicating with Adam along the way. However, unlike last time, Kandin and Weevil are nowhere to be seen, and of course, there's no Meta Kraid to be found either. In fact, by the time Samus gets to the last area of the game, there's hardly been any living creatures at all. When she makes it to the laboratory, she finds the culprits for this disappearance of wildlife in the planet's interior, and the only living creatures left in her way, Metroids, which, unlike the last story, have evolved into all the evolutionary steps minus the Queen. After Samus works her way through this small score of various Metroids, she hears what sounds like an intense battle in the midst near her. She traces down the source of the noise, but when she enters the room, she doesn't see a fierce duel unfolding. She witnesses a slaughter. Manipulated by Sylux, both Kandin and Weevil have been fused with Metroids, similar to how Sylux was in the last story. And to test them, Sylux has sent the two of them to fight the strongest native creatures he could find. Samus walks in just in time to see a few notable creatures being taken out at the hands of the Metroid-infused hunters, namely another member of Crocomyre's species and another member of Kraid's species, both of which are decimated by the hybrids. After seeing this, Samus is spotted by Sylux, who commands an attack with the Metroid hybrids, and the two of them together charge after Samus, while Sylux stays at a distance with his deadly shock coil. Samus finds out that she is unable to use her life drain on Kandin or Weevil due to them being infused with their own Metroid DNA. Sylux, meanwhile, upon seeing the use of this ability and the danger it poses to him, wisely decides to retreat, which happens around halfway through the fight. Sylux didn't just cower and run away though, as before he leaves he grabs a secured Metroid larva and sets off a self-destruct sequence for the planet, gunning for his starship in the hopes that Samus won't escape the combined forces of his experiments in time to flee. Of course, Sylux ends up being mistaken, as Samus destroys the mindless Weevil and the crazed Kandin while a timer of their mutual demise goes down, similar to the final Dark Samus boss fight in Echoes, or the Omega Metroid fight in Fusion. After doing so, she hightails it to her gunship, flees the planet, and returns to explain the events of the mission to the Federation. The game ends here, but just like last time, there will be 2 post-credit scenes. The first scene shows Silex walking with some elite Kraken guards that manage to escape the planet, Trace among them, and brings them to a mysterious and massive space vessel adorned with lab-like structures. Upon entering the ship, Silex and his men meet the crew they were expecting, none other than the ringleaders themselves, whom Silex contacted after his labs and resources were destroyed in the planet's destruction. That one scumbag from Other M is the prominent figure of the ringleader members here, warning Silex that what he has to offer better be worthwhile or they will be escorted off the ship. Silex more than makes it worth their while, as he first shows off a Metroid larva he escaped with, explaining the experiments he succeeded with and telling them of the potential his future experiments would have if he were to use the ringleader's resources. However, the second sample he brings is what really wins over the Federation faction, as Silex shows off a specimen that makes the Kraken and the Federation soldiers in the room gasp in terror. It's the reason that Silex chose the planet he did amongst all the planets in the cosmos, and it's the reason he needed to do his Metroid experiments in the first place. In a sealed container held by Silex, the source of such terror, and the motivation behind every action Silex took up to this point, lies a captive, ex-parasite. The second post-credit scene has a much-needed breath of fresh air for the Federation. Using the details of Samus's mission, they make a desperate call for help from bounty hunters and Federation reinforcements alike. Of course, the Federation force responds to this message, and while they aren't equipped to handle Silex himself, they can fend off the invading Kraken forces, but that's not all. You see, over the course of this mission, the player finds out that unlike the last story I've created, where the planet was abandoned by the Ela or the Enkron, in this version of the story, the planet was a Diamant homeworld. Angered by the destruction of his people's former home, Spire arrives on board a Federation vessel and agrees to hunt down Silex personally. He's not alone though. Noxus, greatly disturbed by the threat Silex poses to the galaxy, also agrees to join the Federation in their hunt for him. And with that out, the stage is set for Samus, Noxus, Spire, the Federation force, and the rest of the Federation to join forces to take down Silex, Trace, the ringleaders, the Kraken Empire, and their nefarious experiments revolving around the Metroids, and as they'll learn in Metroid Prime 5, the ex-parasites as well. With the story of the game out of the way, that just leaves the gameplay as far as the game itself is concerned. This section will be fairly short because chances are it'll mostly play like the trilogy, but I do think a few upgrades have the potential to be made alongside some general tweaks to the mechanics and world design. For one, I think the lock-on feature isn't gonna make it into the new game. With modern controls giving developers at Retro dual stick for the first time, as seen in Prime Remastered, I can only imagine that they view lock-on as redundant and just let the player aim by themselves. I also think Retro is gonna make the game a little faster, and they'll do it in two ways. One would simply be increasing the speed of Samus in game, and the other would be adding an upgrade that allows Samus to move faster. I think it's possible that the speed booster or the flash shift could make it into the game, but almost certainly not both. The speed booster would be the more likely of the two. To compensate for this increase in speed, Retro will make the game more open in terms of level design. No, I'm not saying Prime 4 is going open world, but I do think the areas will be more open than before, primarily by removing a lot of the short hallways found in the trilogy, and just connecting the larger rooms together instead. To further this added world connectivity, I think Prime 4 will return to being a single planet rather than multiple like Prime 3 or Hunters, which fits the setting of the story since the game takes place on a hideout claimed by Silex, and in terms of gameplay will allow the developers to flesh out this one world without worrying about any other planets. Also, it's been over 15 years, it's time to update the visor graphic in-game. The Morph Ball camera will also see an upgrade, as the camera system hasn't been changed in 20 years and could use a few improvements. Other than that, maybe we'll see some stuff like the Crystal Flash come back, but after the tweaks I mentioned, the gameplay changes will be insignificant. Since I don't want to spend too much time on graphics or cutscenes, I'll simply say that the graphics will have the same style as Prime Remastered, but will be noticeably improved in fidelity, and the cutscenes will be more cinematic than before, or at least relative to Prime 3 in scale and scope, considering that Retro has hired multiple developers who have been known to work on very cinematic games. I also think a big feature only present in some of the Prime games could very well make its way back into this entry. Multiplayer. Call it wishful thinking, but given that Samus and Sylux are locks for the next game, and other characters stand at least a good chance like Ridley or some of the hunters, having a multiplayer isn't really a crazy idea, and combining that with the sheer length of Prime 4's development, it's possible that developing multiplayer modes is part of why they've taken so long to make the game. Considering the time and resources that have been invested into Prime 4, I'll take a wild guess and say that if multiplayer is included, it will be more fleshed out like Hunters, as opposed to the rather bare bones nature of Echoes, featuring unique character choices, and more excitingly, perhaps different modes, kind of like how they made Blast Ball a thing in Federation Force, separate from the main multiplayer. I'm not saying Blast Ball is going to make its triumphant return, we live in the bad timeline after all. But with some wishful thinking and a little creativity, I can imagine Retro making some fun new modes for Prime 4, like a capture the flag type game where everyone tries to grab a Metroid from the opposing team, or maybe a game mode harkening back to Metroid Blast from Nintendo Land, where everyone except one player is ground-based and have to team up against a stronger, airborne opponent. Perhaps Samus and the Federation Force could team up against Ridley as the flying opponent. I'm just spitballing here, of course, but my goal isn't really to nail down the multiplayer modes that might make the game, it's just to get my general idea across. And that idea is that we'll see a return to form for Metroid multiplayer, featuring Echoes-esque traditional FPS multiplayer with a level of depth akin to Prime Hunters, and on top of that, we'll probably see some other little side modes, more bare bones than the main multiplayer to save on time and money, but making up for it in weird concepts and wacky executions. With the actual elements of the game out of the way, I'd like to quickly discuss the external forces surrounding the game. Of course, that brings us directly into the territory of discussing the release window, since obviously nothing else about this game would matter if we never even get to play the thing. It's at this point that I must speak of an extremely enticing prospect regarding Prime 4's launch, because I don't want to talk about the time frame first, but rather the system. The release of Prime 4, in my opinion, is more likely than not to do something no Metroid game has ever done before: become the launch title of the next Nintendo console. And no, I'm not counting the Prime Hunters demo, that was a demo! I don't believe this is a guarantee, but I'm making this my prediction because the game has no real competition in my eyes. When you consider it, the major franchises that have previously been launch titles likely aren't going to be the debut game for the new Nintendo console. 2D Mario hasn't been a launch title since the DS back in 2004, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder is releasing this October, so a 2D Mario launch title is simply out of the question. Outside of that, no new major Zelda game will be due for years since Tears of the Kingdom just came out, F-Zero and Pilot Wings have been dormant for over a decade, and it's pretty safe to assume they aren't making Tetris the launch title again. Of course, there will be a tech demo kind of game, but even with monumental hits like Wii Sports in that area, other games have come out as launch titles too, in that case, Twilight Princess, so I don't see how that would detract from Prime 4's chances of being a launch game. Even franchises without precedent as launch titles really don't stand to challenge Metroid. Splatoon isn't getting a new game for years, with Splatoon 3 being less than a year old. Kirby is in the same boat as Splatoon, with Forgotten Land and Dreamland Deluxe having both come out in the last 2 years. Mario Kart doesn't seem likely for a new game, with active support still ongoing as of this transmission in the form of the Booster Course DLC. A few other series like Luigi's Mansion and Animal Crossing, while having not received new games in a few years, tend to have long gaps between releases, with Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon and Luigi's Mansion 3 being 6 years apart, and the gap between Animal Crossing New Leaf and New Horizons being 7 years apart. So we shouldn't get a Luigi's Mansion 4 until at least 2025, and we most likely won't get a new Animal Crossing until at least 2027. That should leave only 3 relevant challengers: Smash Bros., Pokemon, and Donkey Kong. DK hasn't gotten a game from someone other than Retro since 2007, and that's if we count spin-offs, which obviously wouldn't be a launch title, so it's extremely unlikely that DK has a game in the works at all, and if he did, it won't be big enough to be a launch title. Smash Bros is super unlikely as well, since Sakurai is in a state of semi-retirement, and I very much doubt Nintendo would risk making the launch title of their brand new system be the first game in a long-standing franchise without its creator working on the project. Either that, or they use some voodoo to get Sakurai out of retirement, but in that case, a new Smash Bros. Game would still be way off of the new console's launch time. That leaves Pokemon as the last major hurdle to Prime 4 being a launch title. Pokemon has always sold well and the games come out fairly frequently, so it's one of the most likely contenders for the launch title spot. However, I doubt Nintendo would make Pokemon the launch title considering two small problems and one big issue. The minor issues are, 1. The popularity of the previous games and similarities with all the games would make it hard to convince consumers to buy a new console for Pokemon when they could just stick to the old ones, and 2. The quality of Pokemon in the last decade, give or take, has been undeniably poor, and I doubt Nintendo would want to push non-Pokemon fans away from the new console by making a poorly developed and rushed game as the launch title. The big issue, however, is that Pokemon always sells well, regardless of its circumstances, so I doubt Nintendo is incentivized to push it as a launch game when it's gonna make bank no matter what happens. After that, any other franchises simply wouldn't be chosen over Prime 4. Metroid would be a safe take over the likes of Yoshi, Wario, Fire Emblem, and other franchises of relative popularity given the advantage Metroid has in the way of a big new game releasing. All in all, I think Metroid Prime 4 is a clear-cut candidate at the moment to be the launch title of the new system, with only a few games you could really argue as being contenders for the position, and all of them except Prime 4 have some sort of caveat or another. So I believe Prime 4 at this point is intrinsically tied to the release of the next system, and I've hinted at saying that I don't believe the new Nintendo console will take all that long to release. So when exactly do I expect the new Nintendo system to arrive? Well, I think after the recent Nintendo Direct, it's guaranteed that the console isn't coming out this year. However, the slate looks pretty empty for 2024, with the only new first-party title confirmed then to be an unnamed Princess Peach game, and the profits from the Nintendo Switch have fallen below expectations by Nintendo's own admission. That's where I believe the new console will swoop in, being shown off sometime early 2024. The release will be sometime late in the year, which is standard for Nintendo consoles. Then, during the Summer Direct, they'll reveal the release date for the new system, which I'll take a guess on and say the date is November 16th, 2024, with Metroid Prime 4 in tow as the technical showcase and the launch title. And just to be clear, I do believe that Metroid Prime 4 will launch on the Switch as well. Unless Retro is getting paid to sit on their hands for years while Nintendo created the next console, I doubt the game hasn't been developed for and with the Switch in mind. To put it simply, Metroid Prime 4, in my opinion, will be a cross-gen launch title, much like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, given that there's very little competition for that spot. Given my time of release for the game in late 2024, I think the trailer would appear early in the same year. They wouldn't show off the game before 2023 ends, and like I said before, the June Direct practically confirms that. But at the same time, they wouldn't wait until just a few mere months before it comes out, if my guess is right about it being a launch title, and also because they've just invested too much in the game by this point to have it only be given a couple months between reveal, or really re-reveal, and release. My guess is that the first trailer would be early in 2024, the first Direct to be precise, being shown off alongside the new console as a reveal and a showcase. Nintendo Directs usually happen on Wednesdays, and the earliest Direct of any given year is typically of February, so I'll say that we'll see our first real trailer for Prime 4 on February 21st, 2024. The game, once it comes out and everybody realizes how excellent it is, being a Metroid game and all, brings into question how well the game will sell. Now normally new Metroid games sell between the 1 to 3 million range. However, a couple of factors have me believing that this game will go a lot higher than that. Of course, like I said before, I think this game is going to be a launch title, along with being cross-gen, so the advantage of having the new console and being the big new game on it, and being on two separate consoles, let alone the Switch with its massive install base being one of them, gives it near limitless potential. Another reason I think this is going to sell better than the rest is because Metroid has noticeably gained more traction and popularity as of recent than ever before. Of course, Dread became the highest selling game in the series in less than 6 months, and Prime Remastered moved over 1 million units in 6 weeks, with physical shortages. Though, I won't say I'd call that a sales success. Moving 1 million units is generally the bar for successful games, so I'll count it reluctantly. And with the recent use of Metroid's popularity, it's extremely unlikely that Prime 4 gets within a 10-mile radius of the lower bound of those sales figures. The last thing that truly sells this game's success for me is just the mystery of it all. People love mysteries, and what bigger mystery has there been for Nintendo in the last 6 years than the mere existence of Prime 4? Anticipation grows with time, and uncertainty grows not only fear, but wonder, curiosity, and intrigue as well. Make no mistake, there's a lot more excitement behind Prime 4 than there is a normal Metroid game, and that can be largely accredited to the lack of info and trailers that Prime 4 has had so far. And of course, being 6 years in the making, Nintendo has a lot of time, money, and resources being put into this project, so I have full confidence that the marketing for this long-awaited title will go hard. I mean, what reason would they have to put this much effort into making a game just to release it with no fanfare? There are other minor factors I can mention quickly, like the aforementioned lack of competition from things like a new Zelda game and the like, or how it won't have to deal with an anti-2D crowd, the way Dread faced controversy from some people for being a 2D $60 game. But I think those 3 reasons I talked about before are the main reasons that Prime 4 is going to easily take the crown of the best-selling Metroid game. To give a verdict, I imagine it'll sell somewhere between 5 and 10 million copies for a broad estimate. I think it'll lean towards the higher figure though, so for a more specific estimate, I'll say 7 to 10 million. And lastly, just to throw an exact number out there just for kicks, I'll say it finishes its lifespan on store shelves with 7.93 million units sold. On the lower end for a launch title, but considering Nintendo's investment into the project and their apparent interest into bringing Metroid into the next level of game sales-wise, I doubt they'd look at that and say that it wasn't worth establishing Metroid as a much more profitable series. Now, assuming my prediction for the sales of the game are correct, what would that mean for the future of the franchise? I mean, of course with sales like that, the series would garner a whole new lot of consumers and fans, but what would this spike in popularity lead to? First of all, I'll address a bit of a hot-button issue in the community. If Metroid Prime 4 becomes massively popular, a Metroid movie is virtually guaranteed. I mean, we know Prime 4 is going to be very cinematic based on some of the hires, so if Nintendo sees the cinematic Metroid game going ape on the market, their eyes are naturally going to turn to the next step, which would be putting Metroid in cinemas. If you didn't know, Nintendo recently established a subsidiary for movie making named Nintendo Pictures, and keeping that in mind, it's not unbelievable to think that a Metroid movie would get made regardless of what Prime 4 does. But if Prime 4 is a smash hit, how can Nintendo possibly look at their franchises to adapt a film and not be enticed by the one of their only IPs with a cohesive and easily translated storyline and chronology, with the golden opportunity to strike while the iron is hot? I think we'll see a Metroid movie someday no matter what, considering they've tried making one before when video game movies hadn't learned their lesson yet. But if Prime 4 shatters sales records for the series, Nintendo will no doubt be a little more motivated to make the movie happen. The next thing, of course, would just be the well-being and frequency of the new games. It goes without saying that if Prime 4 sells like hotcakes and makes all of Nintendo's investment into the project more than worth it, they wouldn't have much problems investing more into the franchise in the future. That wouldn't just mean that Prime 5 would be a lock afterwards, but it would also mean that there are more resources to be invested into the project, and more resources that would go into other Metroid games, like Metroid 6, Echoes and Corruption remasters, assuming they aren't in the works currently, or whole new projects we wouldn't see coming. Maybe we'll get that Metroid Warriors game after all, eh? To sum it up, if Prime 4 goes crazy in the sales department, Nintendo is far more likely to greenlight more Metroid projects, more out there Metroid projects, and would be more lenient with giving higher budgets to said projects, increasing the sound quality, graphical fidelity, and giving higher chances to the series continuing to be top quality since they can afford more top-notch developers. And lastly, it goes without saying, if it sells well, Retro Studios will most definitely be trusted with the next game from the start, meaning no more project resets. All in all, Metroid Prime 4 is looking to be a very exciting game, likely to make the biggest innovations to the Prime series we've seen yet, alongside an enthralling story presented in a very cinematic way. All of that with the possible addition of multiplayer, and we've got ourselves possibly the biggest release of, if I'm correct in saying so, 2024. Should it release then, and become the mega seller I believe it can and will be, then we as Metroid fans can rest assured knowing that the future of Metroid is brighter than ever, and that the new wave of fans will virtually guarantee the continuation of the series in games, and perhaps other mediums as well. And with that, I've said my large piece on Prime 4, so it's once again time to go. Thank you all for tuning in, keep hoping for Prime 4 to arrive in the meantime, and I'll see you next broadcast. Wait a second, I forgot to give it a name. Let's see, both my stories involve Silex, Trace, Candon, and Weevil. I got it. Metroid Prime 4 Hunters. Okay, that one's taken. Well, there are some Metroid hybrids in my stories, so what about Metroid Prime 4 Fusion? Okay, fine. We've been waiting for this game for like 6 years. So how about Metroid Prime 4 Return of Samus? Would you settle for Samus Returns? Rats. Come on, there's gotta be something that'll work. Something no one but me would be bold enough to call their game. Oh. Metroid Prime 4 Barrel Blast. Really? Fine. Metroid Prime 4 Awesome Baby College Hoops. What? Okay. But what about Metroid Prime 4 Move It? Okay, I'm starting to lose my sanity here. Wait, that's it. Metroid Prime 4 Sanity's Requiem. How? Just... Alright, hold on. I'm gonna think this one through. You know, Prime 4 has taken a super long time to develop, and given that Return of Samus and Samus Returns are both taken, I think I've got the perfect name for such a game. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Metroid Prime Forever. Motherfucker!